Thank you so much, David, for this kind introduction. Indeed, my name is Aslan. I'm a Berlin-based international TV presenter and journalist, and it's a delight to be back here in Georgia. And I can tell you, we have 60 minutes to talk about the implications of the war in Ukraine for the future of Europe. So a very narrow approach, but a very important one, obviously, nonetheless. And I couldn't have asked for better panelists. This is an all-star panel, ladies and gentlemen. The one to my left, of course, the gentleman to my left, you know him all. He is the former foreign minister of Lithuania. Please welcome Linas Linkevičius. The person to my right certainly needs absolutely no introduction in this part of the world or beyond, for that matter. I'll give him one anyway. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and, of course, a former U.S. ambassador and U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. Volker, ladies and gentlemen. She is a former long-time member of the EU Parliament for the Greens and currently the Vice Chair of the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom. Rebecca Harms, ladies and gentlemen, is here. Delighted to welcome on the channel the former Commanding General of the US Army in Europe and a Senior Advisor to Human Rights. First, General Ben Hodges is here with us. And last but certainly not least, he's the director of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies and a former Swedish diplomat. Fredrik Löjdquist is here, ladies and gentlemen. Minister, let's start right away. Let's dive right away. Once a minister, always a minister, so I'll address you as one. The state of Europe amidst this war that started on February 24th. Much has been made about the praise that Europe has received during this time for showing unprecedented unity and resolve. Would you concur? Would you agree with that statement?
Usually, when I'm asked like this, I can see some problems. And frankly, in your question, when you're saying that the war started on 24th of February, it's not right. Ukrainians will tell you that war started 8 years earlier. And by the Georgians, their territory was occupied in 2008. The same size, almost the same size like now, so to say, it's done in Ukraine. So that's answer to your question.
Sure, but the context since February 24th has changed.
Yeah, but I mean, how late it came, you know? That's my point. Yes, reaction unprecedented, sanctions unprecedented, but again, I'm not going to criticize, but just let's be frank and let's be also honest when we are talking about this united support, how late it was done. Some colleagues, unfortunately, were thinking that Ukraine will fall in 3-5 days, and better not to support, because there will be more victims, right? Then they realized that they can fight, they even can win, but then some colleagues were hesitating that Russia will lose too badly. Again, a problem, so how to find this middle? And here it comes. Weapons must be supplied in big quantities. They know how to handle, they know what to do with these weapons, and our task to make sure that this support will face no fatigue. Economic, financial, military, and here is our major task. And winter will be really decisive moment, not only for Ukraine, but also for European patience, for this absence of fatigue, for continuation. So this really, we're approaching very, very important moment, because Putin calculates that he probably will survive due to these same sanctions, which are not efficient enough yet, because not felt so substantially in Russia. They will really survive until the end of the year. Economy will not collapse even for the beginning of next year. And they calculating that Ukraine will really not do the same. So our task is really to make sure that this is continuous and even increases.
So praising the unity and resolve on the part of the EU while acknowledging that it is coming 8 years, or rather 14 years from a Georgian perspective, too late. Rebecca Harms, you of course know Brussels inside out. You've served as a member of the European Parliament for many many years. You've gone through all the crises that the continent has to offer, from the Euro crisis, refugee crisis, Brexit, and so on and so forth. What has surprised you post-February 24th about the stance and approach on the part of the EU?
I think we should not forget, while we are following that the European Union is getting better in his responses to the challenges posed to us, and especially the Ukrainians by Russia, we should not forget that the European Union was trying to do business as usual while facing a 1 year's build-up of a huge part of the Russian army, while facing that Belarus was integrated in the Russian world to be better able for the Russian army to attack Ukraine. I think this shock moment for most of the, at least Western EU politicians and also citizens, this shock moment was not necessary. But it was the result of decades of failing to get Putin and Russia's Russia, as many Ukrainians called it before, to get it right. So Hugues Mingarelli, our former EU ambassador to Ukraine, mentioned on this panel before that he mentioned a moment where the failure really became visible. And that was after the attack in Georgia. That was the moment when the EU and NATO refused membership to the Eastern Partnership countries. Maybe I'm wrong, but my feeling then was they do it to not provoke Putin more. But to be honest, since that wrong decision, they offered Putin a kind of plate, yeah, because they accepted the Russian interest in the region. They decided to go this road of not provoking Russia. If they would have been more open to integrate this part of the world, then probably an attack of Russia, like we see it now, would not have happened.
But what has surprised you the most, maybe in a sentence or two, what has surprised you the most about the European Union post-February 24th? In one sentence, perhaps.
So I'm normally optimist, but now let me start with my deep concerns. What is surprising me most is the gap, the huge gap between declared solidarity, unbreakable solidarity with Ukraine, and the lack of the necessary weapons supply.
So the gap between the rhetoric and the actual and the actions on the ground, Kurt Volker, coming in from an American perspective, as somebody who knows this continent, knows Europe very well, Washington for years, if not decades, have been trying to get to Europe, saying you need to step up your act, you need to contribute, you need to play a vital part in defense securities. Looking back at the last 6 months, what would be your assessment about the European performance?
Right. Right. So thank you so much, Ali, and it's a pleasure to be here. And first, this is a historic period that we are living through right now. That Linas is right, the war was going on long before February. But February marked a change in the clarity with which we can see the world that we're living in. And that has several implications for Europe. The first one is that the ideologies that Europe thought that it had banished, fascism, genocidal fascism, and imperialism, are alive and well. And they are a threat to Europe still. So this is not gone. The second thing is that the policies of wishing that it would be better, of ignoring the things that we don't like, of trying to engage this fascist and xenophobic and aggressive ideology with dialogue and engagement and hoping that we will have an impact. They failed. Those policies don't work. Gray zones, places in Europe where, yes, there's us in the West, where we're democratic and prosperous and secure and we have our institutions, but there are other places that are not there yet, and they're nearby Russia. These gray zones are a danger to Europe. It's not that they're not ready. No, the fact that they are not part of Europe is a threat to Europe, because that is an invitation for Putin to take advantage of them in every way imaginable. Information, corruption, military, ideology, war crimes, using these as a launching pad for trying to break up European solidarity, NATO solidarity. So therefore, fourth point, the EU must take in the gray zones. There is no way for Europe to be sure of its own democracy, market economy, prosperity, and security unless the gray zones are eliminated and these countries are part of that same Europe. And then fifth, that applies to NATO as well. What the Swedes are telling us, what the Finns are telling us, is the only security in Europe that matters is NATO. Forget Budapest Memorandum, forget security guarantees, forget a wink and a nod, and forget, I admire the porcupine strategy, but the reality is the two biggest porcupines in Europe say it's not safe to be a porcupine. You have to be part of NATO. So that is where Europe must go after this.
And certainly we'll take a deeper dive when we do the second round, Kurt. I want to hear more about that, of course. But General, you are actually somebody who has predicted a Russian attack, even when some so-called experts out there were saying, no, quite rather unlikely. You, of course, turned out to be right. As somebody who has a political but also military dimension and perspective here on this, Rebecca Harms was saying, what surprised me the most was the rhetoric, the solidarity rhetoric, but the lack of action actually when it comes to supplying sufficient weapons and so on and so forth. Would you concur? Would you agree with Rebecca? Is that also your assessment looking at the current situation?
Well, if I did predict, I'm obviously not a very compelling speaker. Look, the alliance has done more in the last 6 months than in the last 6 years. I mean, it's amazing how rapidly the nations, and it took all 30, to agree to make the changes, the repositioning that's been done. So the alliance is actually in much better position. I think the Chinese are very unhappy with Russia right now because we all woke up probably 2 or 3 years before China would have wanted us to wake up, start increasing production. But where I think that we have fallen short, and the Biden administration has done a very good job, except we have exaggerated, overstated the risk of a possible escalation by the Kremlin. And our European allies either agree with that or can hide behind that. The Kremlin has nothing with which to escalate. The only thing they can do is a nuclear weapon, and I think the likelihood of that is very, very close to zero because they get no benefit from it. And so and if they did use a nuclear weapon inside Ukraine, it would be impossible for the United States not to become directly involved, and that's why I'm sure they won't do it. So because of that, all of us have been spooning capabilities that Ukraine needs instead of saying, we're going to fucking win. We want Ukraine to win, and here's what they need. And I think Germany, France, Italy, those countries would actually be much more active. But because we half step in some ways, I think that they tend to do the same thing.
I see. Some of those countries, of course, we will mention and explain more in detail, Rebecca Harms. I'm going to come to you in a second, of course, about the role of Germany, the vital one here, needless to say. But Fredrik Löjdquist, let me turn to you. This war has been a wake-up call, is what General Ben Hodges is saying, a wake-up call for Europe to get its act together, to show the resolve, to show the unity and show the strength to the rest of the world and to Putin, most importantly. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think we're halfway. I mean, there has been a lot of good things done in the last 6 months, but it has been reactive. So now we need to turn into a proactive mode, and we need to have sort of long-term visions and strategies both for Ukraine and Eastern Europe and Russia. And that has to start with the realization of the nature of the Russia crisis, of the problem, of the Russia challenge, which goes far beyond Ukraine's borders. This, which was expressed by John Herbst and Bobolo and others today, this is about our way of living, our political system and so forth. And that needs political leadership to explain that to voters. And I don't think that really has sunk in either with the political elites in Europe or nor the electorate. So there's to do that. Because what we do and what we don't do today will define not only what Russia and Ukraine will be for the coming generations, but what the European project, what Europe is for the coming generations. So there's very much at stake. There's no way going back to any kind of status quo ante. This nostalgic longing has to disappear for that. And for this, we need a new vision, new policies and new tools, and to combine them holistically, reconstruction of Ukraine, security support, EU membership, and all of that. And we need to put that all together and put in resources on a qualitatively totally different level. And this is an investment. This should not be seen as a cost. This is an investment in the future of Europe. And we must be looking forward and not backward. I see this as an opportunity maybe to reconnect to the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. However distant that may seem at the moment, but that's, let's have a look at that. So, and I think that's a sort of long-term project, and I think we also need to turn the tables because our Eastern Europe policy has for a very long time been a function of the Russia policy. What will they think in Moscow? How will Moscow react? Now we should make the Russia policy a function of our Eastern European policy, that because Ukraine must win and Russia must lose. And that's the most important way we can also influence future developments in Russia. But in the short term, I see the coming 6 to 9 months as really crucial. Because this is sort of, sanctions will kick in, Russia will be much harder hit next year. But we have a winter coming and, gas delivery is a very, scary debate in Germany and other European countries now about the cold winter and economic recession. And it's a question now, we need to have the patience, the coherence, the stamina to take some pain for the next 6 to 9 months.
Interesting listening to our esteemed speakers here, who all seem to believe and reiterate the point that the Western Europe is at an inflection point, or rather was at an inflection point, and now with the war may have found a new purpose, for lack of a better term. Whether it's going to seize the moment, that is a different story. Whether this new sense of purpose will have legs, as we say, Minister, we will, of course, we will see how the story plays out. But let me ask you, before I go to Rebecca and ask her about the role of Germany in particular. The war is now in its 6th month, a very sad anniversary at that. And winter is coming, as Fredrik was said, and the citizens of Europe, perhaps not so much the governments, but the citizens may be experiencing somewhat of a war fatigue here once they start to feel the impact of the war in their own pockets. Is that something that you're concerned about, listening and talking to many European citizens?
Yeah, as I said, and I'm afraid that there are some politicians, maybe not very vocal for the moment, but they would like to come to some kind of agreement with Putin. They still believe that he will survive and Russia will still continue with this current leadership, and that's a very, very dangerous fact. I wish to be wrong, but I believe this is really the fact. Yeah. And that concerns me, indeed. We have to understand, if we are repeating to each other that Ukraine must win, but that will not help, And that also means that Russia must lose. So we should understand this fact. and should be painful loss. Because when we're talking about winning, it's also, let's discuss what that means. We're not talking about bombing Moscow, you know. We're talking about cleaning Ukrainian territory from Russia. That's a victory. And to take Moscow will be task for Russians. To take Moscow, if they need to get back to civilized world, if they need to lift sanctions, if they wish to their, so to say, sons and daughters to travel and to live a normal life, they need to do themselves. And if they will not lose painfully, they will not do that. And now again, when Putin hints about possible, if you noticed via Peskov, there are some messages, maybe they are ready to negotiate, right? Under their own terms, of course. But this is definitely will be freezing of conflict. It's not peace by far, nothing to do with peace. It will be break to get back their power, and after some break, to continue and with even double, so to say, force. And that would be, could be, even this geography could be expanded. So what concerns me, it's exactly the understanding what's going on. It's still not yet, not shared by everyone, and our task really to explain that this is really decisive moment of truth by all means. So this winter, again, coming back to what I told already, and colleagues probably will share, will be really decisive moment, not only for Ukraine, but also for the West, for European Union, for support, which should be continued on the double, I would say, especially military support. And when talking to Ukrainians, they're very optimistic, at least as far as I know. They believe they will win, they're encouraging each other, and they're doing quite a good job. It's also psychology, because Russia is doing that, and they're not afraid. So this is very, very, let's take this example ourselves, that also let's be optimistic at least, but not just optimistic by words, but let's continue what you're doing, and we will win. We have no other option, basically. By the way, there's no option, even.
There's simply no other way, an option than to win this war, to send a very strong signal to the Kremlin, not just for Ukraine, but beyond. Rebecca Harms. Let's talk about Germany here for a second. A country, of course, that is the most affluent, most populous country in Europe. Many calls for German leadership here, and much criticism that is being directed towards Berlin for being too hesitant, for perhaps even being a brake on many decisions being taken. This new government, of course, we've had Chancellor Merkel for 16 years now. Her legacy may have to be rewritten after this. But Olaf Scholz, how would you assess his performance? At the end of the day, your own party, the Greens, are also part of this coalition. Is Germany doing everything that it could at the moment?
So that's an easy to answer question, no. But that's so the same answer for most of the other bigger countries of the Western Alliance. I'm sometimes ashamed when I see what support is going to Ukraine from the Baltic countries, from Poland, so also concerning weapons, and what compared to this is transferred, is delivered from my country, Germany. How comes is the real question. And I think, so also because I'm still often in contact with my former colleagues and friends, for example, in the Baltic countries, the Germans have not yet understood that this is not Putin's war, but a Russian war. They have not yet understood what others in this conference today said, that it at least may be the Third World War. It's not incorporated really into the German debate, and especially not in how the people feel about the new world. So the concerns about high energy prices and heating costs in winter are right now going up, and the interest in this huge and horrid war in Ukraine is going down. So, and I think parts of the government, especially the Chancellor, failed for a long time to really communicate with my compatriots in an adequate way. And that has to be changed, and it has to be changed by all democratic politicians. So Germany needs, and I see the same for France and other Western EU states, they need really a wide political consensus to be able to deliver what Ukrainians need. And to give you one example, so until today, groups of my colleagues from Verkhovna Rada or civil society activists, veterans from Ukraine, they come to Berlin and they have to lobby to get weapons. So we are following the news from this horrid front line, especially also now these fierce battles around Kherson. And those brave people come and ask, give us tanks. Yeah, some months ago they came and said, help us to close the sky. So it's really, so for me it's shameful to see that while the government says we do everything we can for Ukraine to win, so we, until today, refuse to deliver our tanks. We have the weapons industry in Germany declaring they are ready to ramp up production of ammunition and tanks, etc. But the government still is lacking the decision to take this offer and to deliver. And let me finish with one thought. So what I said about the failures when the West decided to refuse NATO membership and EU membership. It was about not provoking Russia. So the weakness in the weapons delivery, I think it's still connected to this old idea that we could make mistakes and provoke Putin and his regime even more. So, and that's also reflected in this idea that we say, Germans say it, we want the Chancellor says it, we want Ukraine to win, meanwhile he says it. But they are reluctant to say we have to defeat Russia. And that happens in a country which in the last century had to be defeated so that a new and peaceful Europe was possible.
Kurt Volker, a very frank... Very frank, very honest words from Rebecca Harms, the criticism directed towards her government and saying Germany doesn't quite get yet that at the end of the day this is not just Putin's war but Russia's war, perhaps evident by the fact that President Zelensky was calling on the West to ban Russians from traveling, and it was Chancellor Olaf Scholz who said, well, I really don't want to punish ordinary Russians for Putin's war here. If you're looking at the current state of Europe and Germany in particular, what does Europe need to do? France gets a free pass here a bit, it seems, no?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are several things. You know, we could go on all day.
Of course.
But I'd say most immediately, France and Germany should be pushing the European Union to meet its commitments to helping Ukraine financially get through the war. This is something, $5 billion a month, as John Herbst was saying this morning. It's exactly right, and this has not been delivered. And Ukraine is printing money. They're trying to keep people on payrolls. They are trying to keep the economy going, but this is not sustainable as it is. So we've got to see at least the European Union follow through. And this is something where France and Germany both are the drivers of this in the European Union. Another thing that I think that they should do is, really look at what they can do to give Ukraine capabilities that they are not doing. And Rebecca mentioned this, but Germany and France both have military capabilities that they could be sharing with the Ukrainians, and they should be doing that urgently. There's no reason to hold back, just as there's no reason for the U.S. to be putting artificial lines in what we're willing to do. And then there are so many other things. I think that, first off, a key point that all of us, and it would be especially important coming from Germany and France, but a key point that all of us should be making is that we expect Russia to live within its borders. There's no reason why Russia should have a special pass compared to any other country in Europe. They need to live within their borders. And that's Georgia, that's Moldova, that's Ukraine, that's anywhere else Russia thinks that it might invade someday. No. Russia has to be like any other country and live within its borders. And that gets to the point of negotiations as well. If there's going to be an end to the war, we should be telling the Russians today, there needs to be an end to the war, and the basis of that is you have to withdraw your troops from Ukraine. There's no peace, there's no negotiation, no nothing, until you get your forces out of Ukraine.
General, we're all on the same page here listening to the speakers. More weapons, more heavy weaponry needs to be delivered to Ukraine as soon as possible. We heard it's not a matter of months or years, but rather days and weeks. As somebody who comes with a great deal of military expertise, and I'm sure is conversing and talking often and frequently with your counterparts, European counterparts, why is this not being done?
Well, I think some of our European counterparts are waiting to see what the U.S. does. And if we don't lead, if we don't say we want Ukraine to win and we're going to do everything possible for them to win, the best phrase I heard the last 6 months, not from President Zelensky, was when Secretary Austin said, we're going to help Ukraine win and we're going to damage Russia so much that they cannot threaten their neighbors anymore. Like, holy hell, somebody finally said it. You know, I never heard win in 20 years in Iraq or Afghanistan, but he was never allowed to say that again. Yeah. And so the fact that there is no clearly identified strategic end, I mean, we spent the last 8 years talking about somebody's laptop and Giuliani and whether or not to provide a javelin. That's not strategy. If we have a strategy for the Black Sea region, then you can have policies for Ukraine, for Georgia, and other countries in the region that make sense. And that means you have to have a clearly identified strategic outcome. And if we say the outcome is Ukraine is totally independent, able to defend itself, exactly what Kurt said earlier, and that Russia cannot threaten its neighbors anymore, okay, that's very clear. Then we're going to take from the 300 HIMARS launchers that we have, for example, and instead of 16, we're going to triple that. All right, and we're going to tell the people in Camden, Arkansas, go to 24/7 shifts around the clock and make more rockets for that HIMARS. But because we haven't said that that's the objective, then we end up.
How do you explain this lack of clarity on the part of Washington?
Because the administration and lots of others from previous administrations have exaggerated the risk of escalation. When the president and the national security advisor say, we don't want a World War III. First, we're already in World War III, number one. Number two, there's nothing else the Russians can do. You said it earlier, they've been at it for 6 months. Yeah. They have less control of Ukraine now than they did 4 months ago, and it's getting worse for them every single day. Their logistics are exhausted. The only thing, and nobody wants to be in the Russian army, you can be sure of that. All those people that were at the beach when that airfield was hit, the next day they're all heading the hell out of there. They did not want to defend the Holy Land of Crimea. So they're exhausted, and they have no will. And we know that war is a test of will, and it's a test of logistics. What we need is our administration to stop self-deterring and say, all right, we're going to win. We're going to call their bluff, and we're going to win.
Fredrik, clear words from the general saying we need to take off the rhetorical shackles and call a spade a spade. Name the situation for what it is, namely war, and a war that needs to be won. Your own country, of course, along with Finland, it has broken their isolation, if you will, and the neutrality held so dear for many decades, set to become members of NATO. Clearly, the thought process behind it is we're stronger together. This unified approach and this message from DC, is that what the Europeans are waiting for to make the next move?
Well, in practical terms, I think the general is right on that, but that's also partly because the strategic the strategic impact what's going on has not been fully realized yet in Europe, and perhaps also not in Washington. And that's what we need to realize. The costs of if we allow Russia to benefit from military aggression, the cost of that to the whole European and global security system, there must be no fruit of aggression, because then we are on a very bad slippery slope and the moral hazard of security policy. And that's that's of course needs to happen here now. But in the longer term, you also have to make sure that Ukraine succeeds to become a modern European country, integrated into the European Union, and also countries like Moldova and Georgia and so forth. So winning the war is one thing, but we also need to sort of win the peace after that. But at no circumstances Russia can benefit from this in one way or another.
Minister, in June, EU member states have been granted, or rather have granted Ukraine and Moldova, of course, EU candidate status. Georgia wasn't in the mix as of yet, but might join later. The question I have is, do you think that the granting of EU candidate status would have happened without this war? Do you think this is a direct result and implication of what is happening for the past 6 months?
No, I don't think so.
Really?
Yeah, really, because it's not surprising, because if we'll talk about that a year ago, nobody would even dream about that. Nobody even think about that, And I'm afraid even now I'm afraid that some believe that it was given like a boost, psychological support, but they do not believe this is real. So why some leaders talking about very long period until it will happen? So we have to understand that we have to do what we're talking. We have to mean it and to do it. This is very important. And it's by far it's a very very long story. By the way, it's again when we were talking, it was shame when we are reluctant to give European perspective to these countries. Even if you remember, there are some double standards, I would say, when you comparing with the Balkans. I'm not criticizing Balkans now, but it's another story, by the way, how they share European policies and how they're doing that, not only in deeds but also in rhetoric. It's another story. But we're not allowed even to put in the wording of our documents European perspective. It's a shame. So you're asking, is it real? Of course not. It was not real to expect something what will happen. But now our task may be to fill with the substance. And I believe it's very important that they include it, including Georgia, by the way. European perspective for Georgia means a signal that Georgia also inside the club. And we now have to work hard to fill gaps, and frankly, this is our task, common task, to make sure that this will happen in reality.
I'm going to come to the audience in just a moment for some questions, but Rebecca, may I ask you for a couple of sentences on this?
Exactly on Georgia. So because I agree with Linas that granting candidate status or this a bit weaker proposal to Georgia does not mean that the road is paved, and it's a straight way into the European Union. And there will be lots of discussions which Linas and myself, know very well. But on Georgia, so I'm here in Georgia since 4 or 5 days, and I met some of my former colleagues and friends from civil society. And please, dear Georgians, don't miss it now. Don't prolong the mistakes committed by EU towards Georgia and others in 2008. Don't prolong these mistakes. Do it now, and it's feasible.
To it now. We're coming now. We're going to take 2-3 questions, and I'm going to throw it back to you. But Kurt, it does seem the timing, right? If we're looking at EU member states granting Ukraine and Moldova EU candidate status. We're seeing EU starting accession talks with Albania and Northern Macedonia. These are things that weren't happening before.
Yeah.
And I think the fear is, let's not lose out any more of sphere of influences to the Kremlin here.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Ali. I think that we wouldn't have seen these steps now without Russia's invasion. But what Linas is saying is, do they really mean it? And that I don't know. That's what we have to fight for.
And that's what remains to be seen. Up here, Eto, yeah, please introduce yourself quickly. Yep.
Hi, Eto Buziashvili, Atlantic Council. A couple of days ago when Gorbachev died, I found a very illustrative thing on social media. The Western Europeans were mourning one of the greatest politicians of 20th century, while Eastern Europeans were remembering the bloody crackdowns which took place in Baltics and in South Caucasus. And the same gap is applied to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, support to Georgia, etc. How do you imagine this gap to be filled, and how long is a term, this gap to be filled? Thank you.
Thank you, Eto. Let's take two questions more. The gentleman, has had his hand up. Yeah, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Sergei Kapanadze from GRAS, a think tank here. So I understand we're all preoccupied with Ukraine and with the war there. But there are also other occupied regions in this part of the world, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria. So basically the question is, isn't it a high time for the West, for the EU, NATO, next Swedish presidency, Germany, United States, to also start thinking about what could be the strategy towards these regions, the strategy aimed at possible prevention of annexation, or the strategy for deoccupation, because they're kind of beyond the attention at this point.
Thank you so much. Let's take one final question in the back. You seem to be having the microphone throughout all sessions. I love it. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Nika Chitadze, professor of the International Black University. My question is taking into consideration the title implication for future in Europe, energy factors for the energy security, taking into consideration that in 2021, European Union consumed about 180 billion cubic meters of natural gas imported from Russian Federation. In the current situation, we know how, by this way, dependence on Russia is decreasing. And at the same time, we know that European Union works for the filling the gas stock by 80%, yes, till the starting of the winter. At the same time, by this way, Azerbaijan expressed readiness to import the gas on the European market by 30 billion cubic meters. Kazakhstan, oil and gas. How, by this way, those energy factors will affect on the energy security of Europe, and also, by this way, decreasing the geopolitical influence of Russia.
Thank you so much. I have a feeling you won't have to introduce yourself for the next question, for the next session, rather. Let's start with a very important one, energy, of course, here. And you can take the questions that pertain to your field the most. But let's start, General, with energy. Energy security is high on the agenda. Germany's role here has been repeatedly mentioned many times for making itself so dependent on Russian gas. And Moscow and the Kremlin has proven that it will weaponize gas moving forward. How do you assess the situation? Maybe one of the implications of this war is a much faster green transition on the European continent, no?
Yeah, I think actually on the long list of President Putin's strategic failures, the ruining of his own gas industry is going to be close to the top, as nations have been forced, including Germany, which has done actually a very good job, without much credit, of getting themselves off of Russian gas. A few years late, but nonetheless, I mean, it's happening now. And so I think this would be part of a broader strategy for the Black Sea region that we've talked about, which means you also have to build infrastructure. The infrastructure is not adequate to the task to get this done. And then my last point, I would say, I think we're at the beginning of the collapse of the Russian Federation as we know it today. Like within 5 years, pieces are going to be coming off. And so we were not prepared for the fall of the Soviet Union at all. We should make sure that we are thinking what are the implications for energy as well as everything else as the Russian Federation comes apart.
Well, your predictions usually come true, so we'll watch out for that one. Fredrik, as the director, yes. as the director of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, perhaps Eto's question is pertaining to your field. Does anybody also want to answer the questions? Please go ahead.
On the, there's some questions. I mean, both on the, sort of this gap and the cognitive dissonance between sort of Western Europe or the Western world and people in the region, but also the strategy of EU. I think it's important to realize that we are now in a historic dynamic situation. We are not observers anymore. We are actors. What we do and what we don't do play a role. And I think on this gap, I think it's quickly being narrowed by Russia's actions. But there's still, the Europeans need to understand that this is about us. This is also a threat. This is not a local or regional conflict in some difficult, strange countries over there, and it doesn't affect us. This is about our own very fundamental values and norms of our societies. And, you know, people discussing heating and electricity bills and so, it helps because, but the blame needs to be put where it belongs. This is Putin's blame. On the EU, I think, if I understood the question right, Sergei, I mean, we need now to sort of combine, you know, the association instruments we have, which are pretty, in the DCFTA, which are pretty good and far-reaching. The association agreements here in Eastern Europe are more far-reaching, and the tools combined in them with some of the membership accession instruments for the Balkans and so forth. But we need then to switch that into sort of when the membership negotiations start. But that needs to be put together with the security compact, with the security component, and with both the short-term financial support and the long-term reconstruction of Ukraine. So we need to take a whole new holistic approach to this.
Kurt, Minister Rebecca Harms, I want to get you in here just quickly. Kurt, perhaps which question would you like to answer?
Yeah, I want to address Eto quickly and then Sergei. So on Eto, I think your question was the perception gap between West Europeans and everybody else. And I think the answer to that is it depends on us. That we have to be out there speaking and clarifying to make sure that people see the world right in front of them, explain what's happening, and just be relentless. Don't let people fall back to a comfort zone of thinking that, oh, we have to do dialogue with Russia, oh, you know, we can get along. That's gone. That's gone, and we have to be the ones to speak up. Sergei, I want to come back to something that Nicola Tenzer said this morning because he put his finger right on it. It would be great if we had a strategy to work on Abkhazia and get the Russians out, or to get them out of South Ossetia. But the world we're in today is that we are watching Russia fight and hopefully fail with our help in Ukraine. And the only way we're really going to get to Abkhazia and South Ossetia now is if Putin is defeated in Ukraine. So we should put our efforts into that.
Minister, of course.
This gap issue, which concerns me as well. I believe this is very simple because when you believe that something happening but not with you personally, that means it's not maybe even not happening at all. It's like science fiction, you know. And that was exactly the experience by some of our colleagues, I'm afraid to say. For instance, maybe Kurt, remember when we were discussing the NATO security strategy in 2010, there was a big group of enthusiasts to call Russia a strategic partner. And we are protesting, a handful, as usually of us, aggressive handful protester group, saying that how we can call strategic partner a country which 2 years ago occupied sovereign country Georgia, you know, what kind of partnership? But there was really illusion, and that was really, then we managed to make sure that our relations are of strategic importance, I'm almost quoting. So it means we we nurtured aggressor, not we personally, but we made these exceptions, this endless appeasement, this caveats, you know, and they raced like that. Now this blatant behavior is not out of the blue. It's happened like that. So this gap exists because we created this gap ourselves by our hands. Why they should not repeat what they did in Georgia? Because price was agreeable. Right. Price was agreeable. They did that. Right. And why not to repeat? So now it's understanding that something happening with us, all of us. So we have to react because no way to step back. And this is the reason. So gap will be narrowed, but at a very big, painful price, I'm afraid, as usually. How many wake-up calls needed to wake up? Usually should be one, but in our case, there are many.
Well, sometimes. I guess that's why the snooze function was invented on the iPhone.
Very creative.
Well, Rebecca, quickly perhaps, do you want to answer one of the questions? If not, I'm going to do one rapid final round, giving you 60 seconds each. I know David is waiting in the wings, but we started a few minutes late, Georgian style, so we're gonna. Yeah. Okay, then let's start with you. Let's start, because the one final question I have for all of you, and perhaps you can answer in 60 seconds, is what do European countries or institutions should or must do right now to help Ukraine? European countries / institutions, right now, 60
so right
seconds.
now, fulfill all decisions, send all money, free all macroeconomic assistance for Ukraine. It's possible, but it's blocked. The EU has made the right decisions, but is blocked by some member states. So that has to happen. Besides what I said about weapon supply, I would like to add that I think the EU states altogether have to decide a kind of new mode. So we have to create some kind of war industry, war economy. And this becomes visible also in the whole debate about energy supply and security of energy supply for the EU states. This has to be addressed as a common issue. And so member states should stop to suggest to their citizens that there are national solutions. In this, we really need European solutions, and these solutions must already include Ukraine.
Kurt.
I think it's very clear. I think we need to hear from European leaders, every single one of them, as loud as possible, that we will continue sanctions on Russia, we will continue support for Ukraine, arming Ukraine, as long as it takes until Russia agrees to live within its borders.
Clear enough? I'm going to come to you, Minister. I started with you, and I'm going to finish with you, Fredrik.
Very kind. So we need, right here now, we need a stamina for the next, as I said, half a year to 9 months. And we need to do all the things that was said here. But we also need, in the back of our head, to keep on sort of on these long-term strategies and toolboxes